Hey everyone, Paul Kagabine, the Adult Event Coordinator at the Garland County Library, bringing you yet another virtual event, but tonight we're going to do things a little differently than normal. So first of all, we'll welcome back Sonny Kay, who's the Executive Director of the local nonprofit Key Arts. So hey Sonny.
Hey Paul, good to see you again.
You too. I had really fun interviewing him, what was it, back at the end of September. We discussed all kinds of things from his history as a figure in the art and music scene to the impact of the pandemic on Key Arts to their possible plans for 2021. So it was a good conversation, and if you're interested in any of that, you can go back and watch that video after this one. Well, instead of him being the guest and interviewee, Sonny is actually going to be the guest interviewer tonight. And the person he's interviewing, who's the focus of tonight's program, is Jason Heller. So welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Thanks, Sonny.
Absolutely. And Jason Heller is a Hugo Award-winning author and a book and music reviewing journalist. He's contributed to places like NPR and Pitchfork, and I'm sure Sonny will get into more of that and many other things with him in their interview. But we just got a couple copies of one of Jason's books at the library. Strange Stars, David Bowie, Pop Music, and the Decade Sci-Fi Evolved. That's kind of a mouthful. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's it.
And I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but I just got to say, just because of the cover alone, it's getting a good amount of attention there at the library.
Yeah, and I got to say, for people who are art fans and are aware of the really popular artist Butcher Billy, right now, he's the guy who did that illustration on the cover, and I'm super grateful because, yeah, I'm still blown away by it every time I see it. So,
yeah, it's a cool one. I mean, we used a lot of this image for the flyer to promote this interview, and that got a lot of good feedback from people. It caught people's eyes, even if they didn't know what it was going to be about. Cool. Did you ever? I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but have you ever personally had the honor of meeting David Bowie, the late great David Bowie, before he passed?
No, I did not, unfortunately. My first concert when I was a kid, as I talk about in the introduction to Strange Stars, my first concert was David Bowie. Of course, I didn't get to meet him, but it was, but kind of not just one of those big formative experiences like anyone's first concert usually is. It was definitely something that I think set me on the path to eventually writing this book.
Very nice. All right, so I'm going to turn the discussion over to Sonny and Jason. But before I do, if anyone watching has any questions or comments, as always, post them below there in the link, and I'll be monitoring the program in the comments. So at the end, when they give me the cue, I'll hop back in and read off anything you had for them. So until then, I'll see you both here on the other side.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Jason, it's great to see you.
Hey, great to see you too.
And full disclosure, Jason and I have known each other for at least, I was trying to put a number on it, at least 25 years.
I would say 25, 26.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, right around there, maybe a little longer, actually.
Maybe a little longer, but yeah. And of course, from the underground music scene in the Denver and Boulder area, where we both cut our teeth, so to speak,
yeah,
way or another. I have so thoroughly enjoyed your book, Strange Stars, Jason, and I actually have read it twice, still doing my best to retain all of the amazing details that are in it. I'm a huge lover of Mojo magazine, and to me it's like a encyclopedic issue of that. It's fantastic.
Oh yeah, I love Mojo magazine too. Yeah, so I'm sure that seeped in there somehow.
I guess, why don't we talk about, I mean, you have a really personal sort of motivation for taking this path and eventually writing this book. Why don't we talk about that first?
Yeah, like I mentioned a second ago, David Bowie was my first concert when I was a kid. And at the risk of just sounding like, you're kind of cliched nerd that has, it kind of became a real archetype, particularly in the 80s when I was a teenager. I mean, I pretty much was like that kind of nerd. I was really shy, was really into science fiction, didn't necessarily go out and do a lot of the partying, type of things that a lot of other teenagers did at the time. So to me, going to see David Bowie was really interesting because David Bowie himself is not a nerd, right? As we think of nerds, he's this glamorous, beautiful, larger-than-life rock star. But I think that a lot of people like myself saw the nerdiness in him, you know what I mean? Especially for kids like me who were into science fiction and saw the recurring influence of science fiction on David Bowie and how clear it was that was just one of the things that drove him.
Right.
So it was a really big connection. Yeah.
For the sake of clarity, Jason, let's make it clear. This took place in 1987.
I think it was 87. Yep.
The Glass Spider Tour. Bowie's Glass Spider.
It was David Bowie's Glass Spider Tour, which actually wrote an article for The Atlantic a couple years ago about how it was a critically reviled tour for being overblown and extravagant and a real example of the excess of 80s pop. But for all those reasons, it's exactly why I loved it. And I didn't necessarily see that as a bad thing, especially at that age. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was 87. It was 87 that I saw him. And that just always stuck with me. The whole idea that I loved music and I loved science fiction. And in the person of David Bowie, those two loves of mine came together. And that's always just kind of stuck with me. Those were always seemed to be two parts of my life, music and science fiction. So when I got the chance to write a nonfiction book about some form of music history, it was just a no-brainer. I wanted to tell this story about how science fiction and music overlapped. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was just the book I felt like I was born to write, to not to sound too cheesy. I hope.
I can understand that. I mean, it's a remarkable achievement, I think. I would feel sentimental about it knowing you, I think, regardless, but it's particularly it touches on so many things for me that resonate with me. Star Wars was incredibly important to me when I was a kid. I was 5 when it came out.
Yeah.
I didn't get to see it until I was 6 or 7, I think, and that waiting period incubated this mad obsession with it that lasted for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years or something until, junior high or what have you. But there's so many things, there's so many little details in the book, so many threads that touch on things that I never would have imagined reading a book about. For example, groups like Boney M, who just are not the kind of band you ever expect to pop up in a book of rock lore. They're just one example. I mean, I think it just serves to illustrate just how deep this goes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting examples from the book too. So you have Boney M, who were basically a disco act, a European disco group in the late 70s, and a lot of the book mostly takes place in the 1970s, and which I regard as kind of the high point of science fiction music. And what I really wanted to do was dispel people of the notion that it was just progressive rock bands like Rush and Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who I love those bands. I love that whole movement of music, but it wasn't just those bands and glam bands like David Bowie that were influenced by science fiction. That Boney M being just one example, there were tons of disco and funk and jazz and just a whole wide variety of music that for different reasons latched onto science fiction and approaching it in different ways. And disco is a great example because disco exploded in 1977 in terms of popularity, the same year that Star Wars came out. And there is just there's definitely a flashpoint where those things, even though they don't seem really connected, you had a lot of producers, disco producers like Giorgio Moroder, who were in essence doing this futuristic sounding electronic kind of disco music, which really kind of took over that sound by the time the 80s rolled around. And there were a lot of science fiction-y themes and approaches going into it. And sometimes it was kind of cheesy and flashy in a good way for me. And sometimes it was a little bit deeper. And I think that that's just really interesting in that regard. I tried to put that in the book, how some artists, musical artists, approach science fiction from a really serious standpoint. And some did it from more of like a fun, colorful, spectacular standpoint.
Right. With that in mind, let's back up just a little bit and talk about concepts that's the concept of Afrofuturism as it relates to music and pop culture of the time. I guess in some ways that movement, if you want to call it that sort of trend anticipated the more popular mainstream embrace of science fiction kind of first, right? Kind of like before it really went pop, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the jazz artist Sun Ra, who began recording in earnest in the 50s and was still going very strong in the 70s, didn't have lyrics to his music. He wasn't singing about science fiction, but the way he and his band presented themselves on stage, the way he spoke in interviews, saying that he had visited other planets with a completely straight face, and it's still kind of up in the air whether he really believed he did or not. But the themes of his albums, the covers, the song titles, the presentation on stage in these amazing outfits that evoked ancient African civilizations as much as they evoked science fiction futurism, really helped kind of set the tone for a lot of the funk bands in the 70s and disco bands too, that started to take that idea and popularize it. Because Sun Ra, very well regarded, but not what you would have ever considered a popular artist. He was even on the fringe of the jazz world.
Right.
So, the biggest example of that is Parliament in the 70s, taking a lot of the concepts and the aesthetic of what Sun Ra was doing, but turning it into not just this version of funk music that pushed a lot of the boundaries technologically with its use of synthesizers, also started to create this entire mythological science fiction backdrop to their music. There would be characters that would recur throughout songs and albums, and it sort of became like this giant science fiction story, novel, or movie that was kind of playing out through all these different Parliament songs. So what was great about Parliament was they sort of combined a lot of the more conceptual ideas that science fiction is really known for, but they also were very into the flash of science fiction and how stunning it can be visually. And they just perfected it, and they hit their stride right in the middle of the 70s. And in a way, a lot of the science fiction music of the 70s can kind of be split before Parliament and after Parliament.
Okay. And I guess for them, I mean, the visual component for them was not only record covers and stuff, but it was in the production of the shows themselves.
Oh yeah, I mean, there would be an actual flying saucer on stage, and George Clinton, the leader of Parliament, would emerge from the flying saucer, like on stage. There's this really amazing theatrical elements to it, which in a way it feels like was an outgrowth of glam rock, particularly like what David Bowie did, and it was just amazing how Parliament was able to synthesize all these things. They were taking advanced, innovative musical equipment and ideas. They were expanding those, but they were doing it in a way that it was still danceable. You know what I mean? It was very progressive, but it was like progressive funk. It was still music that you could dance to, that you couldn't not dance to.
Right. I think that it's fair to say that the music of Parliament, exactly what we're talking about, is a direct forebear of the music of someone like Nico, who is very well documented in your book. And another thing for me personally, that's a funny footnote to this whole thing, because when I was a kid, first moved to California when I was 7 years old. First or second Christmas, in lieu of Star Wars stuff, new stuff that there was this obsession with. I was given those Nico records, Star Wars Disco, which was so confusing at the time because I knew it wasn't legit, but it existed on a record, and clearly, some people were excited about it, and it was this just a strange anomaly to me that I didn't realize was part of a much bigger sort of explosion of cultural feedback generated by Star Wars.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Sonny, you and I are of the same age, and like that was a huge thing for me too, was that Star Wars record. So if people watching aren't familiar, Miko was a record producer, and he put out a record in 1977, right after Star Wars came out and became such a phenomenon. And it was a disco version of John Williams' various themes from Star Wars. So it was like this orchestral disco thing, again, combining like the two biggest pop culture phenomena of 1977. And a lot of people did kind of view that as like a cheap cash-in or a rip-off.
Sure.
But the thing is, Miko actually is a huge science fiction fan. Like, he had no idea that this was going to be a huge hit record, which it was at the time. All he knew was he was producing disco. He'd been a lifelong science fiction fan, and Star Wars blew him away. He saw it right when it opened, and like so many people in 1977 were so blown away by Star Wars, they would leave the theater and get right back in line to watch it again. They couldn't believe what they had seen. And he was one of those people, and I think in a way it always kind of disappointed him that no one took his love. Like, it was a very sincere love for the music and the topic. He had no idea, but he couldn't convince his record label at first to even release it. They thought it was a ridiculous idea. But he persevered because of his love for science fiction and his love for disco. So for people to kind of take it as like this cheap, silly novelty record, I mean, luckily he had some consolation in the fact that he made millions of dollars off it.
I bet he did, yeah. I bet he did. I was confusing because the cover art had nothing to do with the film.
No. And I don't think they could have. So the cover art is just like this, robotic lady. And I think that the record company either couldn't afford the rights to it or just didn't even want to bother trying to go. This was supposed to be a quick release as soon as possible after Star Wars. And I think that they just kind of wanted to push it through, push it out into the market as quickly as they could.
Right.
but it all worked. And you're right, Sonny. When we were little kids, when that came out, we didn't really know the difference. You know what I mean? I don't think that we really had being that young, had a lot of preconceptions about like, is disco good or bad? You know what I mean? Or it was just, for me, and maybe for you, it was a way, like, you couldn't just go home and stream Star Wars after you saw it. You know what I mean? And as kids, you couldn't afford to go see a movie whenever you wanted. You had to kind of keep the movie in your head and relive it in your head. And that record was a way to kind of do that. You know what I mean? It was exciting in that way. Yeah, definitely. It had a really cool power, especially I think for younger kids.
And I guess it probably had an accessibility for people that the actual soundtracks themselves didn't. Because I remember having those soundtracks as a kid and never listening. Because why would you listen to orchestral music when you're 12 years old?
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing. I was talking about danceability with Parliament, and like, I remember being in my bedroom dancing around to it, to that record, because there is something beyond thought, beyond intellectualizing or judging music when you are dancing to it. You're still listening to it and you're still processing it, but something different is happening. I think that when you have that visceral connection to it through dancing, it makes a total difference. And even if you weren't physically dancing to Miko's disco version of Star Wars, it was still moving. You could still feel that beat. And I think that in general was the salvation of science fiction music in the late 70s. Is it kind of evolved past a lot of progressive rock artists making really intricate, virtuosic songs that you just had to kind of sit and listen to in headphones and have your mind blown. And it became something that was for everyone. Science fiction music was for everyone at that point. Just like because of Star Wars, science fiction was now for everyone, where it hadn't really been before.
The book is so dense in the best way possible, and I imagine you probably were forced to leave lots out. I would suspect, just for the sake of having it fit into 300 pages or whatever it is.
Yeah, I did, unfortunately. Yeah.
I mean, I was stunned by just the sheer numbers of the sheer breadth of influence that sci-fi has, that Bowie specifically has. Did you? I mean, certainly you expected to find a lot when we set out to do this, but did you expect to find quite as much as there? I mean, I personally am so surprised by all this. It's much.
Yeah, it did surprise me. I mean, I was someone who kind of felt like I was pretty well versed in the topic before I went into the book. And Sonny, you know that I worked at a record store, independent record store called Wax Trax in Denver for about 10 years. And for 10 years, I basically just listened to music all day and thought about music all day and discovered music all day. And yeah, I thought I had a pretty good grasp on the subject, but the more I dug, the more I discovered things that I had never heard of before, and things that were so close to my area of interest that blew my mind. For instance, I know you as well as I am a really big fan of late 70s, early 80s post-punk. British post-punk and that whole movement that happened. And there was always kind of a sheen of science fiction to a lot of post-punk, not all post-punk, but a lot of certain science fiction writers like Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard. Their work would be referenced in a lot of post-punk artists. Some of them, like Human League, would go on to be huge pop groups in the 80s, but when they started out in the late 70s, they were much more experimental. And I never realized that right at when post-punk was booming in the late 70s, there was actually, and I write about this in the book, of course, there was actually a music festival in England that was called the First Science Fiction Music Festival. And it had almost every one of these bands from the late 70s that I was writing about. And they all happened to coalesce in this one spot for this one weekend. And it was, discoveries like that that made me realize there was more than just this loose assortment and serendipity going on. That there was and synchronicity. There actually was certain cultural currents that were going alongside and then crossing over between science fiction and music in totally different ways. And Sonny, I know you're a big fan of Gary Newman.
I love Gary Newman. I do.
I remember being at Wax Trax back in the 90s and you talking, and your old band, the VSS, I don't know if a lot of people might immediately see the Gary Newman influence and what you guys were doing there, but it was there for sure, I think, anyway. You might argue, but
I absolutely agree.
Yeah. And just as a side note, like, I think, the 90s were kind of a dead period for science fiction music in a lot of ways. It was still here and there, but it was a huge dip. And I mean, I think that the VSS was one of the bands that was overtly futuristic in their presentation. So in a lot of ways, even seeing your band, seeing the VSS back then was a reaffirmation for me when it came to the whole idea that not just music and science fiction could cross over, but particularly things like punk rock and hardcore, which are just not known to cross over with science fiction that much. There are a few instances, but not tons and tons. So to me, science fiction music entered the 70s in mostly on the wave of psychedelic music that the 60s ended on. And then you look at the end of the 70s, just a mere 10 years later, and science fiction music looks totally different at that point. Right. It's something that is synthesizer driven, danceable, whether it be new wave music or disco or electro. Early hip hop had a lot of science fiction in it, especially through Africa Bambaataa. So there was this vast transformation of science fiction music throughout the 70s. And in the book, In Strange Stars, I just tried to trace that in a way that I hope made sense, like sequentially and causally, like that it was something that one thing kind of led to the next. And those connections I didn't really see at first until I started writing the book. So I learned so much about this topic from writing this book, and it was pretty amazing.
I think this book could be a textbook for certain kind of music classes. I mean, I took a history of electronic music class in college that would have benefited greatly from this book like here.
Yeah, I haven't heard specifically of anyone using it in class, but it wouldn't surprise me if it could work its way into a syllabus here and there. That would definitely make me happy to see that for sure.
Do you think it's a fair assessment to say that sci-fi was kind of convenient facade, if you will, or lens through which people were able to get familiar or get comfortable with electronics and making music electronically? It seems like there was so much of the music that we're talking about devoted. So much early electronic music seems preoccupied science fiction in a science fiction way. And I just wonder if, for example, like the first time most people ever heard the Mode was on Here Comes the Sun, right, by the Beatles. But the Beatles using that didn't really, I guess for some people it kind of like, it sort of forced it into the public psyche, so to speak. But it still didn't seem like it was embraced in a really major way for another 10 years or so.
This evolution of the synthesizer throughout the 70s is a major thread of the book. Synthesizers, like you're talking about, with the Beatles and with various other artists, had been used, more primitive version of the synthesizer. But, you got to realize that it's hard maybe these days, since synthesizers have been around so long and are such part of the DNA of popular music now. But when they started being used in recordings in the 50s and 60s, it was as a novelty. There would be Switched on Bach, where, it would just be people playing, Bach music on a synthesizer strictly because of the friction, like the cognitive, dissonance between old music being played on an instrument that sounded futuristic. Soundtracks were a huge way that synthesizers began to be brought more into the public consciousness. But it really wasn't until the early 70s that synthesizers began to be integrated more completely into music. And that was also the point at which synthesizers were no longer used as a novelty instrument and were no longer being used as they were in a lot of cases in the 60s to emulate an acoustic instrument.
Right.
That the native alien sound, synthetic sound of a synthesizer was being used as its own sound and being explored. Its limits were being pushed. And as that happened, as the demand for that increased, musicians wanting to use synthesizers in new ways, the actual technological progress and development of synthesizers in the 70s became more and more advanced. And what was interesting is at the beginning of the 70s, synthesizers were insanely expensive. They were gigantic. And you had to really have a pretty good technical knowledge of electronics and sound technology to be able to operate one. By the end of the 70s, so in a way it was a very prohibitive and almost elitist type of instrument. You actually had to have a lot of money and a lot of technical know-how to operate a synthesizer. By the end of the 70s, synthesizers were small, they were compact, they were portable. Digital synthesizers were coming up, and it became something that was democratic and egalitarian type of instruments, where all of a sudden there were a lot of people that started playing punk rock in the mid 70s because it was so easy. That was the whole idea, is you only needed to know 3 or 4 chords on the guitar. A lot of those artists started migrating to synthesizers in part because it was even easier. it was even easier. You didn't even need to know a single chord, and you could make what was basically punk rock with synthesizers. So there's a lot of really interesting stops along the way in my book when it comes to how synthesizers evolved and were sort of the backbone of a lot of this science fiction music. And a lot of that did owe to the fact that, like you're saying, There is something inherently futuristic sounding about the synthesizer. Synthesizers sounded like science fiction. They sounded like laser pistols or phasers or the hum of machinery on spacecraft. Like those are the types of things that were evoked. So if you were writing, like, say, a really pretty like country rock song, like were so popular in the 70s, for just as an example, you're probably for the most part not going to have this alien sounding synthesizer on the top of it. It's not an organic sounding instrument for the most part. So people were applying it very consciously, knowing that if they're going to use a synthesizer, there's probably going to be something conceptual or science fictional about what they were doing with it.
Right. I think it's interesting to note that Bowie, who's, the cover of the book, arguably the most recurring figure in the book, didn't really resort to any of that stuff. His science fiction is largely a more subtle brand, not reliant on technology. That apparently, I suppose, by the late 80s and 90s, he too was largely a digital artist. At least I know he went through some phases of embracing that to one degree or another. But he was. Can you talk a little bit about his career and how he sort of did return? Or there was the Major Tom character that recurred once or twice, of course, and then other sort of references here and there over the years where he was sort of like kind of circling back the idea, but not necessarily, getting his feet wet like he had in the early 70s.
Yeah, so, David Bowie is the main character, if you will, in Strange Stars, not just because he was the first artist I ever saw in concert, although that has a lot to do with it. It had to do with the fact that David Bowie's obsession with science fiction in the early 70s made him the first major artist to popularize science fiction in music. There were many before him, there were many after, but in 70, 71, 72, as the references to science fiction began to build from album to album, culminating in The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars in 1972, which is a science fiction concept album. He engaged in science fiction from a different angle throughout the 70s, and he would repeatedly dive into science fiction and retreat from it for an album or two, then dive back into it, then retreat from it. He had kind of a love-hate relationship. He didn't want to be stereotyped as this guy who wrote songs about space, but at the same time, he's happily starring in the film The Man Who Fell to Earth as an alien. It seemed like it wasn't that he ever fell out of love with science fiction. He just didn't want to be stereotyped in that way, because he did have other things he liked to sing about. But the gravitational pull that science fiction had on David Bowie meant that he would reevaluate his music's relationship to science fiction every time he went back to it. So Ziggy Stardust came out in 1972, and it's just a full-on rock and roll album. There's nothing futuristic about the music. It has little elements that texturally sound kind of spacey, if you will, but it doesn't. It is not. It's just a rock and roll album. I don't mean just a rock and roll album. It's one of the best rock and roll albums, but there was no real futurism in the music itself.
Right.
When he started to come back to science fiction music in the mid-70s, working with Brian Eno, who was, very, and still is, one of the pioneers of electronic music, then there began to be a David Bowie that sounded science fictional, that sounded like music that could have come from another planet or in the future. And what wound up happening, like you mentioned, is the song that kind of kicked off Bowie's science fiction career was in 1969, Space Oddity, which is, as most people know, this ballad about an astronaut who becomes lost in space, trapped in space. And
which I think, not to interrupt you, Jason, but I think I think maybe young people aren't necessarily privy to the fact that that record was timed to coincide with the moon launch.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, we were talking earlier about Miko's Star Wars disco record being seen as a novelty record. And when David Bowie, who was pretty unknown at the time that he released the song Space Oddity in 1969, since it did come out the same time that Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, it was also seen as kind of a novelty record in the same way, even though it was very earnest in the whole idea of using space exploration and astronauts as a metaphor for alienation here on Earth, and loneliness, and the way that human beings have sort of become estranged from each other in a lot of ways because of technology or through technology. So,
but you make the point in your book also that this wasn't just Bowie cashing in on a momentary thing.
Not at all. And again, it was a song that no one had any idea would become as huge as it did.
Right.
You know?
He had a childhood obsession with sci-fi himself.
Oh, he had been into science fiction since he was a little kid. And I do talk about that in the book, that it wasn't just something, well, first of all, in the late 60s, it wasn't trendy. It was commercial suicide, more or less. You might have a one-hit wonder of a song with a science fiction themed single, but you were never going to have a career based on that in the late 60s, or a career that even extensively dealt with science fiction.
Sure.
And Bowie was the turning point in that regard. He showed musicians who, many of whom all along had been science fiction fans, showed them that they could put that passion into their music. They didn't just have to write love songs, for instance, or protest songs, for instance. They could actually use science fiction songs as a metaphor for protest or love or anything else they wanted to explore, even philosophically. So David Bowie, by the end of the 70s, he returns to, he basically brings back the character of Major Tom that he introduced in 1969 with a song in 1980 called Ashes to Ashes, which is the sequel. So here we have one of the biggest science fiction franchises of all time, Star Wars, if not the biggest franchise, coming up with the whole idea of sequels and building storylines like that. And David Bowie does the same thing. So Strange Stars is kind of constructed intentionally that way, in that since the 70s fall right in the middle of David Bowie's Space Oddity and its sequel, Ashes to Ashes, that I was going to use those two songs, 1969 and 1980, to bookend everything else that happens in the book, David Bowie and otherwise. And it was just weird how perfectly that kind of worked out time-wise. Like, it was as if David Bowie had this huge 10-year plan to construct his career in this way. I don't think he did in advance, but it worked well for me when I was putting the book together. So
sure. He certainly seems to have some sort of, I know his death was sort of not anticipated. Things were kept relatively quiet up until the end. And he definitely returned to sci-fi in a pretty major way on that last record, Black Star, which seems now, in hindsight, kind of a poignant footnote to exactly what you're talking about. I mean, he ultimately, that's where his journey ends, right?
Yeah, I mean, David Bowie, when he died, he had not made public the fact that he had cancer. So it was a complete surprise to the world. And earlier, a few days earlier, he had released his final album, and he made that album, Black Star, knowing that it was going to be his final album. Not a lot of artists get to do that, get to say, I know this is the last work I'm going to be able to do, and therefore use a lot of it as sort of an intentional, like, punctuation mark at the end of their career, a way to sum everything up. And David Bowie could have chose a number of ways to put that punctuation mark on his career. What he chose to do was science fiction. Black Star isn't entirely a science fiction album, but there are a lot of themes there in the videos. There are visual allusions to Major Tom, again bringing that character full circle. And it was as if this entire long and storied career that David Bowie had with this give and take back and forth between science fiction and other ideas that he put in his songs, that at the end of his life, he said, I'm not resisting anymore. The last thing I want to say to the world is a science fictional statement. And to me, that was just a really profound thing. I started writing this book, and I had sold the idea to my publisher and was working on it before David Bowie died. So for that to happen, for that album to come out and him to die a few days later, had a really deep effect on me as I was moving forward writing this book.
Did it affect what you covered in the book, or I suppose it kind
the only way it really affected anything was I had hoped to interview David Bowie for the book.
Oh, what a shame!
And there's no guarantee that I would have had access to him for this project, but there was the outside hope that I could get not just all the perspective that you can find in interviews with him throughout. David Bowie was an amazing interview subject, and there's so much material to draw from throughout the years that points to his science fiction obsessions. But I was hoping to get some evaluation and hindsight from him about that.
I bet he
so that was really the only thing that might have changed the trajectory of the book in that regard.
I imagine he would have been so fascinated to read it. I'm sure
I would hope so. I would like to think that he would have got something out of it. And he's one of those artists that has had so many books written about him, and so many books. Some are straight biographies. Some approach his work from different perspectives. But it was crazy to me that there's no single book that I've ever read, and I've read every David Bowie book I could get my hands on. There's no single work that emphasized David Bowie as a science fiction artist, that looked at David Bowie seriously through the lens of science fiction that he looked through when it came to his own career and his own music. So that was kind of the one thing I just really wanted to do. I wanted to, among the other things I wanted to accomplish with Strange Stars, I wanted to give a portrait of David Bowie as a science fiction author who worked in music rather than prose.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Are you at all tempted to write a sequel to it?
Yeah, since the book stops in 1979, 1980, of course, science fiction music, particularly in the 80s, takes on its own life and becomes something really, really different, especially in the first half of the 80s. But First of all, I haven't gotten any interest in that
No, that's
publishing wise, and I think I would have repeated myself in a lot of ways, because a lot of what happens with science fiction music in the 80s, I write about in the final chapter of Strange Stars. I basically say science fiction music of the 80s has all been set up by the late 70s. And there's not really a whole lot that science fiction music accomplished differently in the 80s than it had up to 1980. There's definitely some amazing artists and amazing science fiction music in the 80s, but most of what had been accomplished in the 80s, the seeds had already begun growing by 1980. And really, if there's one main thing that I wished I could have explored more, is electro and funk, and particularly how and the rise of techno music as well in the 80s. Those are really the elements that did something, I think, really progressive and innovative with science fiction in the 80s. But I think that's probably a book for someone else to write. I would love to see someone else kind of pick this up and take it somewhere else.
Yeah, I think there's certainly, imagine there's enough content for a couple of books.
Yeah. I mean, there's a book. Boy, I am forgetting the title of it. It was actually written by someone here in Denver. It came out soon after Strange Stars, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember the name. It is Sound. Oh boy. The Sound of Things to Come. It was right here on my bookshelf. And it is a book that in a lot of ways parallels my book unintentionally, but it's more about soundtracks and how futuristic and science fictional sounds were used in soundtracks throughout a similar time period. Because my book doesn't go too deeply into soundtracks. And there are other realms too. Classical music, was a very big synthesizer in so to speak, of science fiction and astronomy, and jazz, which I touch on jazz mostly as it crosses over with popular music. I'm a big jazz fan, but it seemed a stretch to put too much jazz in this book. It didn't really seem to fit as well. But there was just tons of jazz, especially in the 70s. I mean, Ornette Coleman had an album in the early 70s called Science Fiction. And there, like I said, I touch on a few jazz artists here and there. But that's a whole thing in and of itself. And of course, Sun Ra's in the book.
Sure, and of course, the repercussions of all that stuff continue today with people like Kamagi Washington and Johnny Lotus.
Janelle Monae being a real big one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It must feel strangely, I don't know, rewarding. That's not the right word, but I mean, to see things like Sun Ra and what we're talking about with Afrofuturism starting to resonate in the works of people now like Beyonce, of all people. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's that some of these things have come, it's taken 40 years, but they have percolated up into sort of popular consciousness. And now they might have seemed pretty far out back then. And now I think society is ready for it. People are have grown up with sci-fi. They've grown up with Ancient Aliens and everything else. Like, I think we're in a different landscape now than we were probably in the mid-70s.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways it parallels the whole in the 21st century, the whole idea that the geeks got their revenge. You know what I mean? It only in the sense that all the things that they were kind of ridiculed about or even picked on or bullied about, became mainstream. You know what I mean? Everything from, you know, Marvel movies to like what we're talking about with popular music. So that now it doesn't even seem like that big a deal. It's like, okay, there's science, like science fiction is like the hugest thing practically in the world. And you definitely don't get looked askance at for being into science fiction these days. And I think that it's just really important to not just take for granted that things were always this way. In a way, I really just have a problem with the whole false dichotomy of there were nerds who like science fiction, and then there were jocks, or, you know, like, there were tons of people making music that was influenced by science fiction who weren't nerdy. Like David Bowie is another, he's the perfect example that we're talking about. Here's a glamorous rock star, a cerebral one for sure, but still. And I like the idea of being able to trace the way these different cultural currents and kind of social currents too, sociological currents have sort of mingled and in a lot of ways have this revisionist history about them that I think I wanted to dispel a lot of ways. It wasn't just nerds making this music. There were sexy disco queens. There were transgender singers doing this. It was an open, safe place for queer musicians and musicians of color to be able to work in. I don't think you would dare call Bootsy Collins a nerd, you know, and the bass player for Parliament, Bootsy is, you know, he's one of the architects of Afrofuturism, as we know it. So I think that there is a lot that I hope people can get out of this book, that I hope no matter your cultural background or your amount of love for science fiction or lack of knowledge even about science fiction, that there's some way you can get absorbed into this book and find something that resonates with you. If you in any way like popular culture, I think there's something of interest in it for people.
Yeah, I think obsession with sci-fi is not recommended at all. Such an interesting read. To me, it just feels like a secret roadmap to the interconnectedness of all of pop culture that no one knows about.
That's exactly it. Like I thought of that many times while I was writing this book, that it was sort of a secret history of 70s music, or like not even a parallel history or a parallel reality, but again, it kind of goes to this whole idea that, you know, history is constructed, and I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but there's a perceived inherited wisdom and historical narrative, even about something as innocuous as popular culture. And just as a critic, as someone who's been, you know, writing about music and loving music for a long time, that just always bothered me that a lot of these assumptions get passed down and not questioned. And there's this vision that people have of 70s music, and I wanted to show the flip side of it. I wanted to show that there was maybe different forces driving that decade of music and continue to drive them, that a lot of people might not see, but they're there. I mean, they were there the whole time.
Well, I think you do an excellent job of doing that. And the book, again, is Strange Stars. Anybody not familiar with it, I haven't seen the graphic pop up. I know that Paul, the library, I we can jump back in. Maybe had a question or two, or there you
go. Try speaking real quick. I'm going to see if I can do this without headphones to see if there's an echo or not. So.
All right. Sounds okay.
Sounds okay. All right. Yeah. All right. Well, that was really interesting and enlightening. So good job to both of you.
Thanks, Paul.
And you got a lot of love in the comment. Interesting. JR said, great to see you both and a fantastic interview. And Colin has been inspired by both of you for decades and has a question for Jason.
Yeah.
Now that the book is out and you've toured a bit with it and nerded out with fans about it, are there one or more artists you totally missed in the book that you would add in if you could take a time machine back to it? Anything obvious? Well, there's a second question. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's actually a band that was put together in the studio in England in the late 70s called the Intergalactic Touring Band, who probably get lumped in with another, any other kind of novelty, so-called novelty act, in the sense that it didn't seem to a lot of people at the time as any kind of serious exploration of science fiction. That Star Wars had gotten big, and so a recording studio and a record company were like, let's get some musicians together to make some like outer space music. But there's actually something really fun and really unique and actually a little more accomplished and interesting about that record. And I didn't get a chance to find a really good place to talk about them. And they weren't really known in the US very much. They were kind of much more of a British thing. So they weren't vastly important in the scheme of science fiction music, but Intergalactic Touring Band are just, I just have a sweet spot for them. It's just a really silly, fun, enjoyable science fiction record.
Colin's second question was, is there anything obvious or anything wildly obscure that has surfaced since you were researching?
Ooh, that's a good question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I mean, the cool thing about a decade like the 70s is, and really almost any decade in the past, is there are always obscure artists being rediscovered and reissued and given fresh attention. And you know what? I bet that there probably have been at least one or two 70s science fiction artists that I didn't mention in the book that I never even knew about until they got recently reissued. But unfortunately, I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Alice says, Jason, good to see your face. And question is, what is the future of sci-fi music?
That's a really tough question to answer. I would like to think that science fiction music from here on out is something that's going to be interpreted and advanced in a way that is beyond simply taking some music that kind of sounds futuristic, which nowadays what sounds futuristic is an inherited sound from the 70s and 80s. It sounds futuristic in the way it's retro-futuristic. It sounds futuristic in the way things did maybe back then. And there's less of an emphasis on the lyrical content being science fictional and conceptual. I would love to see, especially with digital media now, and the ease and the access that people have to digital media and platforms of all kind, I would just love to see more artists, musical artists, go really big with science fiction music. I would like to see them, like Parliament did and David Bowie did in the 70s, have recurring characters, take storylines and world building and have them play not just across music, but have them cross over into prose, graphic novels, theater, virtual reality games like that. It would be amazing to see all these different media that all kind of came together to form a vast story, to form a mythology, a science fictional mythology that uses each particular medium in a way that no other medium can to tell its side of the story. That might be kind of asking a lot. It's funny, there's a band that doesn't get a whole lot of critical acclaim, but were definitely popular more at the beginning of the 2000s, Coheed and Cambria, who actually began to do something like that. And I really applaud them for the ambition they had with having story that went through multiple albums and crossed over into graphic novels and so forth. But I would just love to see some artists really push that and not necessarily just kind of reuse so-called futuristic synthesizer sounds that actually sound nostalgic now rather than futuristic.
I think a good modern example, and I wouldn't be surprised to find out if she was inspired by David Bowie, is Janelle Monae.
Yeah, we mentioned her earlier real briefly, and I absolutely think, and I'm pretty sure she's on the record for talking about in her big stew of influences that David Bowie is in there. So Janelle Monae, to me, is kind of on the forefront of that. But it's interesting, the pattern follows that a lot of artists, even in my book, that when they were smaller and less popular, and in some cases underground, worked in science fiction, that some of them, when they got larger and more popular, started to drift away from that a little bit, maybe in an attempt, conscious or unconscious, to connect with more people, even outside of the science fiction bubble, rather than to use their popularity to draw them in. And I think at this point in Janelle Monae's career, it's kind of hard to see where she might go from here. Whether she's going to continue a lot of the science fictional aspects of her earlier work or not. That's obviously something she dearly loves, and she's talked in interviews about all the science fiction authors that have inspired her. So I'd like to think she has another really grand, amazing, sprawling, like science fiction concept album in her. Knock on wood, I would absolutely love to see that.
JR just commented a good point while we were talking about that. It seems as if the Gorillaz and Bjork have crossed into that multimedia terrain in storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, two great examples, especially Gorillaz, and I see that's the thing is I see a lot of different artists doing little pieces of things, but not one that's really gluing it all together. I think that any artist that winds up doing that and working in storytelling across multiple media like that, Gorillaz in particular are going to be a big influence on that. And they have tinges of science fiction to what they do too, for sure. And then their multimedia presentation, they've done stage and obviously animation along with music. So I no offense to Gorillaz, they're my age or older, and I think that they're doing really well coming, the way they execute things, maybe coming from a technological and aesthetic perspective that is definitely comes from like the 70s and 80s, which is great. But again, I want to see someone younger. I want to see more. I definitely want to see something more in terms of a cohesive, sustained story and world that expands as they go along. But yeah, I mean, both Bjork and Gorillaz are amazing artists who have pushed things in that direction.
another very mainstream example, if you twist it a little bit and look at it a certain way, at least in her music videos and performances, if not so much the music, is Lady Gaga. But I mean,
Yeah.
there's not a cohesive character necessarily, but many.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, you know, again, an artist that makes no secret of her debt to David Bowie, even though, you know, I always want to make it really clear that when we talk about people like Lady Gaga or Janelle Monae being influenced by David Bowie, we're all influenced by different things. Like, those are two completely unique artists that no matter who they're taking influence from are doing their own thing. You know, after this book came out, a lot of people were asking, do you think Janelle Monae is the new David Bowie? And I don't mean to sound glib about this, but, you know, I would say, why don't you assume that David Bowie is the old Janelle Monae? You know, why don't we think about who she is now, what she's doing now, and how she's going to continue pushing things forward in that regard? And this is really presumptuous of me to say, but I would like to think David Bowie would have viewed it the same way.
A comment from Alice: I like your vision of the concepts being more immersive than just music.
Yeah, like I want to see that, but I also think that's just the next logical step. There's always going to be a place for people doing science fiction music on kind of a smaller scale, and in a more obvious way. You know what I mean? Like, one of the most fertile areas right now of science fiction music is metal. And heavy metal has always, and I talk about the beginnings of heavy metal in the book, and the way that science fiction was integral to the development of science fiction music. But, you know, most of the metal bands nowadays are not popular, and they're basically, even if they're progressive or experimental in the way that they make music, they're still doing science fiction music the way they did in the 70s, which was, we're going to take science fiction lyrics and put them in this music. And it's basically going to be a lyrical thing rather than the way it's presented or the way the music is actually constructed. So as much as I love a lot of these contemporary bands, you know, the most obvious and popular metal band that's done science fiction concept stuff is Mastodon, and at least when it comes to a contemporary band. But I really am more interested in seeing the way the whole idea of science fiction music can be pushed beyond, hey, I have this song and the lyrics are about outer space, you know what I mean? Or the lyrics are about dystopia, you know, dystopian future. That's all well and good, but it's so tied to the past, you know? And in a lot of ways, it's tied to how science fiction viewed and presented things in the past, you know? At this point in history, I don't know if there is a real need for many more dystopian stories. There's probably going to be a point where that cycles back, but, you know, I like, that's not what I want to listen to right now. And I love dystopian fiction and have since I was a kid, in dystopian music and dystopian cinema. But I think that science fiction music has to keep up with how things are changing. By nature, it's futuristic, and it needs to look forward in terms of what we need as people out of what do we get out of science fiction music? You know, what do we need from it? What is its purpose? What is its resonance in the here and now? And rather than just kind of going through the motions of what science fiction looked like 30 or 40 years ago.
All right. So before we go, I have a short game for you to play. And Sonny, you're welcome to jump into if you think of an answer before Jason does.
Okay.
I'm going to name a sci-fi universe, maybe book, film franchise, and you recommend a music artist based off of that. It can be any genre you want.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Comes to your mind. You can elaborate a little if you want, but we'll try and do them rapid fire. All right, so I'll give you a freebie. Star Wars.
What would be a good one for Star Wars?
So
an artist who's greatly expanded on. What's that?
I said I thought you'd say David Bowie instantly.
Maybe I misunderstood the question.
Yeah, just recommend based off of the sci-fi universe, any music artist that you think is a good pairing, like
a good pairing. I thought you meant that was directly.
Oh no.
Directly taking it. Star Wars. I wouldn't say David Bowie at all. I would say who does really kind of epics like space opera music. See, most of the groups that were influenced by Star Wars didn't really dive into the storytelling as much. Yeah, that's a tough question. I'm always bad at answering a question on the spot. I always have performance anxiety about things like that. So.
Try another one.
It's a great question, though.
The other Star series, Star Trek.
I would say so. It could be any medium, like books as well.
Well, I was thinking any music artist, but
in music. It's
supposed to be an easy game.
I know, right? You'd think so. There's artists that were inspired by these things, but not as much not as much taking those specific aesthetics and storylines and or even similar ones.
Isn't there a novelty Spock record?
What's that?
Isn't there a novelty Spock record?
See, there's tons of Star Trek novelty records that different. Even Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura in the original series, put out like a disco science fiction record. But that doesn't really count in that regard, and most of the times that music doesn't really stand the test of time. I think about a group in a way like Hawkwind, who I write about extensively in the book. They're this British kind of droning, repetitive, psychedelic, kind of progressive, but their music is too simple to be progressive rock, but it's that big in sound and concepts. And in a way, it's almost like early heavy metal and punk to a certain degree. They kind of put all these things together in the early 70s, and they were very involved. A lot of the concepts were very involved, but a lot of their ideas about space travel and things like that were much more rooted in this weird kind of future primitive idea. I write in the book about how they would talk about being cavemen piloting a starship. Like that's kind of how they viewed like their use of technology and music and things like that. I would say that one of the artists I write about in the book that was a very popular artist back then, who doesn't get a lot of credit for being an innovator and a pioneer in science fiction music and rock, is Jefferson Airplane. Even the fact that they changed their name to Jefferson Starship in the 70s it wasn't just a cosmetic change. It actually was something that was kind of embedded in the leader of the group, Paul Kantner's love for science fiction and doing science fiction concept albums. His stuff in Jefferson Airplane actually was, in a lot of ways, utopian. It was utopian in aim. It definitely was not talking about the here and now being all that great, but it was talking about the idea of humanity escaping to the stars and becoming more evolved and leaving behind things like war and capitalism. And so in that regard, it is similar to Star Trek, just kind of an earlier stage in the development of the Star Trek timeline, because of course, in the original series of Star Trek and the especially the series that are set afterwards in the Star Trek chronology, that's already happened, like humanity has already gotten to a certain point. But things had to get worse in the Star Trek world before they got better. The Earth had to have a nuclear war before this new kind of semi-utopian society could come out of it. And that's something that I think Jefferson Airplane's music addressed in a lot of ways.
You can tell you're a real sci-fi fan and a music fan by how thorough and thought out that answer was.
Thanks.
The Dune franchise.
So what would be a good one for Dune? And Dune is my favorite novel of all time. What would be a good band for Dune? Besides the fact that there are tons of bands that have named themselves after characters and places in Dune. Well, that's another really tough one.
Hole.
Yeah, that's a
Mountain.
tough. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I can't think of a good one.
Sonny, you have anything?
For Dune, I wish I did. I actually don't. I feel like I should. But the only thing I can think of is the band Sleep. And I think it's just because the record cover reminds me of Dune. It's not very helpful. Sorry. Failure on that.
Well, Sleep does sing about caravans across a dust-filled land. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
that's sort of what Dune is in a certain sense. Yeah.
One of the groups with Dune themed names.
What's that?
Who are some of the bands with Dune themed?
Well, a band from the post-hardcore scene would be Harkonnen. That was around. There actually is, I believe they're a German band called Dune, just straight up. Or I don't know if they're still around or not. But yeah, and there's a couple others too. And Grimes, who is a recording artist in her own right, and kind of had this renewed injection of fame for being Elon Musk's romantic partner. She had a concept album early on about Dune that had a lot of songs that explicitly referenced Dune. So I guess I would say Grimes. I mean, and especially that early Grimes stuff is really amazing. So,
Battlestar Galactica.
Ooh, Battlestar Galactica. That's another tough one.
Pass.
Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Let's see, 2001: Space Odyssey.
That one's a little easier because, as I write about in Strange Stars, 2001: A Space Odyssey, when it came out in 1968, really kind of kickstarted in cinema the whole idea of doing science fiction films that weren't campy or low budget or kind of corny or silly in a way. And I say that as someone who loves 50s and 60s science fiction films, and some of them did try to tackle things seriously, but not in the really deeply cosmological and philosophical sense that 2001 did. David Bowie was hugely influenced by that film when it came out. I would say that a lot of the work of what are now termed krautrock bands, and I write about them in the book as well, who are kind of these more minimalistic in a lot of ways, and some of them were very electronic based, German kind of post psychedelic bands. They weren't psychedelic per se, a lot of them, but in a way, I think a group like Emmanuel or even Noi, these krautrock bands kind of would evoke, without actually being based on 2001. The thing about 2001 is this kind of slow moving grandeur, and the kind of the profundity of space and space travel, and human beings pitted against the unknown, in a way that is going to completely change the way they view reality and themselves. And I think that there's a lot of krautrock that feels that same way.
All right, we'll end with a comedy sci-fi, Back to the Future.
Oh, geez.
Thank you, Lewis and the News.
Yeah. What would be good? Yeah, I can't think of anything that would kind of fit like the feel of that.
No bands that their whole gimmick is time travel. I feel like that's its own.
Not its entire gimmick. I mean, there's plenty of bands I talk about in the book that will have a time travel song here and there. I would say that they're.
There's a Spanish group called DeLorean, and arguably
there you go.
Cool because of Back to the Future. I don't know. Would they know about a DeLorean otherwise?
Yeah, that's totally true. Yeah, that one's kind of tough. I can think of a lot of more lighthearted bands that were science fictional but didn't necessarily have to do with time travel. There's a band in the 90s, a punk band called Supernova, who kind of did that. They dressed in big alien costumes, and there was a comedic kind of element, to what they did. It was lighthearted.
Sibling band or something, shared members with another group called Man or Astro Man.
Right, yeah, Man or Astro Man, another band who were mostly popular in the 90s, who had like this costumes and this kind of retro like 50s, 60s science fiction, like low budget science fiction movie kind of aesthetic to them. But yeah, I mean, everyone from Mastodon to ELO has done songs about time travel, but they're very serious. You know what I mean? They definitely don't have that fun quality of like Back to the Future, for instance.
Well, that game can be food for thought for a future article of yours.
Yeah, absolutely, it could. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, those were good questions. I appreciate that. I actually like being stumped. Right?
Yeah, you weren't the whole time, Sonny, and then I just like, what band reminds you of this?
Well, it kind of goes. One of the reasons I wrote Strange Stars was to start a conversation about this stuff. Like, it doesn't. I don't want it to be the end all be all. I don't think it should be. I don't think any book is. I love hearing about things that I haven't heard of before. People who've read the book and have been like, "Oh, you check this out," or "Check this out." Like, I really like I enjoy that. You know what I mean? I don't want to be. I approach this book with wanting to be an informed and enthusiastic fan. I might have certain credentials when it comes to where I've written in the past, but I didn't want to present it as too much of the end-all be-all authority on this. I would love to see someone come along and expand on this and go even deeper. That would make me super happy to see that.
Speaking of Strange Stars and checking things out, you can check it out at the library. We have a couple copies, so you can get it on hold there. And it was a pleasure. This was a great interview. Both of you did a great job. I'll give you both an opportunity, starting with you, Sonny. Let people know where they can find you, what you do.
Okay, well, I'm the executive director of Locus Arts here in Hot Springs. You can find us online at lokiarts.org. I have my own website, my own art is my name, sonnykay.com. And yes, I'm here.
And I can be found at jasonhellerauthor.com. And, I still write for NPR and The Atlantic and publications like that. So you can see my articles pop up there from time to time. And I have a couple new books that will be coming out in the next couple of years. One of them is a novel called Repeater, which is about magicians in the punk scene, wizards in the punk scene. And there is also a memoir that is going to be coming out called Extraterrestrial Summer, which is about when I was 10 years old in 1982 and was obsessed with the movie E.T. and how I watched that movie like dozens of times over a really rough summer for me as a kid. So I guess if anyone's interested in Strange Stars or enjoyed it, maybe be on the lookout for those books when they come out in the coming months.
I'm sure they're going to be awesome.
Thanks. I hope so.
Thank you. It's been really great catching up. Well, we haven't really caught up, but one of these days we will. We'll see you again one day. But,
yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate your time, and it's been awesome talking shop on this stuff. I love the book so much. I can't recommend it more. And let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you both. It was a blast. And thanks for everyone who watched.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Paul.
Good night.